Alright, I'm making 2 videos today. Sound a little bit out of breath. I just did a set of deadlifts there. Haven't been working out as much lately, so I've been out of shape. I'm really putting on weight. It's pretty bad. So as usual, I think I am. My viewpoints are such that I'm not popular with anybody, which I think take as a point of pride to some extent because I feel like I'm able to see all sides of the issues rather than just parroting the usual ideology. So many people are just ideologically driven, either pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. There's no in between. I'm in between on that. I don't think vaccines are bad, but it's been ridiculously overemphasized. There's a lot of things for me like that, I think people should have the right to get an abortion, but I don't encourage it. Most people are either like, it's all about the woman's choice, or it shouldn't happen at all, I'm somewhere in between on that. There's a lot of issues like that, when it comes to LGBTQ, whatever rights, IA plus, whatever it is now. There's people who think that that's totally unnatural, and that, and that, that it's corrupting children. And there's people that think that it's the most natural thing in the world, and that people should be questioning their identity, and that identity is a construct. It's like it always goes into these extremes. I personally believe that if people want to do that, they should be able to, but only when they become adults, so that they are able to make a rational decision. That's to me, that's the between take. I believe in the middle road on a lot of these things. Now, that doesn't mean I'm a centrist. I'm a leftist. But I'm a classical leftist, not an identity leftist, and that's where we get into the reason for this video. So a big part of the reason why Trump exists and why the Democrats have lost 2 out of the last 3 elections is because of identity politics. I've already made this video about identity politics before, but I wanted to specifically go into it a little bit more because it's screwing us classic leftist classics over, And I just saw a great video. I highly recommend it. Maybe I'll link to it. I never do that in my videos, but I might link to Andy Edwards, this British ex-prog drummer. I forget which band he used to be in, but he's a funny guy. He talks about music a lot. And he did a video about our election. And he really well... I'll definitely put the link in the comment box below so that you can check it out. But I'm going to say essentially the same thing he's saying. I think he well summed up what I was thinking, which is the problem is it's so much as this identity politics and now people on the other side. It's become about an ideology. So much of the right is driven by the ideology of Christianity, and so much of the left is driven by the ideology of identity politics. And in the middle, you just have this place where people can come to no agreements because they have faith that what they believe is right. And it's unerring faith. It's dogmatic. They refuse to consider the possibility that they might be wrong. They know within their heart of hearts, as on the left, on the right, it's because God told them, and on the right, on the left, it's because to them, the definition of human decency is believing what they believe and nothing else. This video is for the lefties. I'm not going to deal with the Christian right and that type of thing. Those are people you can't. I don't think I can reason with the leftist, the identity politics leftists here. But I mean, it is the thing about it is for the leftists is that it's they're not. I don't know. It's a shame. There's still things that are liberal classic that that they also believe in, like preserving the environment and reducing wealth inequality. These are things that the identity politics left also believes in, but to a much lower priority for them than the identity politics stuff. To them, the identity politics stuff is king, and the stuff that we all should be caring about that it really affects us universally, and um, really are bigger problems in the grand scheme of things for humanity. The environment and energy production is a much bigger problem for humanity than identity politics. That's not to say that the people who are on the LGBTQIA spectrum and black people and women generally shouldn't be treated with respect and don't deserve rights and deserve this similar to be treated in a way similar to everyone else. But if they're not treated as well as white men historically, it's not a good thing, but it's livable. They're not going to want to hear that. They're going to say it's not livable, but in reality, it is. It's livable. But with the environment and climate change and energy production, unless that whole system is transformed, it will mean the end of us. There's a difference between them living with the inconvenience of not having the privilege of white men versus all of us dying. Disaster, unmitigated disaster. So let's say that I've said this before. Identity politics, in their minds, this is the number one priority. In reality, it's not the number one priority. They may not realize that at this point. There's kind of the frog in the kettle situation. They don't see the boiling over. It's happening. It's a bigger problem for certain. Just the way it is that the right doesn't understand that that's the biggest issue. It is the biggest issue. Science tells us it's the biggest issue. You have to listen to science, but you have to think about the consequences. What are the stakes here? What are the stakes of a black man getting pulled over because he's black versus what are the stakes of hurricanes, floods, droughts, disruption of natural systems, chaos, complete, utter chaos. Think about the stakes there. Which one is going to be worse for humanity in the long run? Anyway, I'm not trying to say that black people getting pulled over because they're black is not a bad thing. I'm just saying we got to prioritize. I've said this in other videos. But anyway, getting to the identity politics, I think the big issue with identity politics, and the reason why it's a losing issue, and this goes to what Andy Edwards said, and you can look in the link below, is identity politics ignores white people who are suffering. It assumes that white people have this great privilege and that we have every opportunity in the world to get ahead. And whether or not our situation is good or bad, we are demonized because we are of a certain group. Just because we're white. Just because I'm a white man. Just because I'm not gay. Just because I'm not, trans. I'm the enemy immediately. It's all about working for people other than people like me. Now, I'm poor. I'm not poor. I'm not poor. There's people who are, I have the luxury of not working a job for a while. Most people don't have that luxury. I understand that. There's a lot of people who grew up in real poverty, who have no choice. They got to work 2-3 jobs sometimes. So yeah, on that front, I do have more privilege in some ways. Well, I don't want to call it privilege, but I have more resources at my disposal than somebody who is poor, and probably, generally, black people aren't going to have the same resources. But my father grew up in Maspeth, Queens. His family didn't have a lot of money. My grandfather was an airline mechanic. I don't think my grandmother had a job. I'm pretty sure she didn't. My grandfather wasn't in completely, destitute as an airline mechanic. He did okay, but, airline mechanics aren't raking it in, he had to, my grandfather was a communist. And, that didn't do him any favors. He wasn't a believer in in work saving and using the stock market and all that. I think he was probably, I don't know how much money, if he had any money in the stock market at all, but my dad had very little accumulated wealth to work with. My dad left to go move to Mexico when he was 18 years old. And, he didn't take a lot of money with him from home. My aunt was able to move to Mexico also. That's why he went to Mexico, because my aunt moved to Mexico and got a job as a TV reporter. And, you could say, well, maybe she got that job more easily because she was white. I don't know. I think back then it was easier to get jobs, especially to make any kind of money as a TV reporter. It's a lot harder to do that now. I think there was more opportunity for you in the old days. But, my dad lived a poor man's life for a while. He was what did he do? He just worked menial jobs. He was a busboy. He worked as a first mate on a tour boat. What else did he do? I can't remember. For a while, he was working menial jobs, but when he was working as the first mate, he was discriminated against for being poor by a lot of the people that were on the boat. This is before the time of Below Deck or whatever this show. They weren't. He wasn't making much money as the first mate, and he decided that he was, he wanted to be a cinematographer. He wanted to be a cameraman. He tried to get a job with CBS News, which my aunt worked for, to be a cameraman, and found out that you had to know somebody in the union, and they wouldn't let you do it unless you were, a union guy or something like that. And he couldn't get in. He couldn't be a cameraman. He really wanted to be an artist. He would have loved to have been a historian, but he knew that wasn't practical, and he was discriminated against when he was working as a first mate for being poor. Basically, none of the wealthy clientele would have anything to do with him. They dismissed him. He didn't like being treated like the help, which he was. He was the help on that ship. So, I say first mate. It was a very small ship. It wasn't like, he had a whole crew like in Below Deck. He was just, he was just a peon. So he decided that he wanted to, make something of himself, as they say, or at least make some money. And he thought it was an honorable thing to, study medicine. So he dedicated himself to becoming a doctor. But he did that in Mexico. He didn't go to an American medical school. He went to school in Mexico, both his undergrad and back then it was dirt cheap to get an education in Mexico, and he was able to get, his MD down there, and he did his residency up here. And, he was a family doctor, not, one of the wealthier doctors, but, he did pretty well for himself. And, we wouldn't have the things we have. All I'm saying is that, he didn't get anything. He didn't get much inheritance from his parents, very little, if anything. I don't know. Like, my grandfather was living in Costa Rica, in some kind of, my grandfather ended up moving to Costa Rica in the long run and lived in some shack. Wasn't anything super. I would be surprised if we got any money at all when my grandfather died. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't even middle class. He was living a pretty basic existence in Costa Rica when he died. All the money we have is because of my father. He wanted to become a doctor. He got his education in a really cheap place. He was able to use the assistance of my aunt, who was working as a reporter in Mexico, and he became a doctor. And doctors come out of Mexico. He was lucky to be able to find a job. They needed doctors. So, he was never going to get the same prestige as somebody who studied medicine in America. But it didn't matter. He was a doctor. He got the certificate, and he was able to find a job here in the States after. He actually worked in a very tiny town in Mexico, providing, as that was part of the requirement for graduating. But he came here and did his residency, and he became a doctor. And all's around me right now is because of his effort. Nothing came to him for being a white man that he didn't earn it himself. Now, maybe you could say, well, he got hired more easily. Maybe if a black man had gone to Mexico and gotten his doctorate there, he wouldn't have been able to get a job in the U.S. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's possible. But all I'm saying is that, none of this around me had anything to do with my ancestors whatsoever. You know, this is all the work of my father. And he worked hard for a lot of years. He worked his ass off. He didn't have a private practice. He worked for an HMO because that, he doesn't like business. My dad doesn't deal with business. He doesn't know much about investing at all. All of my dad's money is handled by, a financial manager. He was never interested in making money. He just wanted to make enough money to get by. My father is not a businessman. He's not an economic whiz of any sort. If he has his way, he would never have to think about it at all. But all this came from his work. Everything that's around me. I mean, there's some things around here. I own some things in this house. There's no question about it. There's some physical goods that I own, but I wouldn't be living in this house right now if it wasn't for him. And the reason why we were able to get this house is because we rented for a while. We actually owned a house in Massachusetts when I was a kid. It was a very cheap house. I think they bought it for like, I don't know, must have been like 40 grand or something like that back then. It was really cheap. They ended up selling it. I think they ended up putting so much money into it because it needed so much remediation. It needed lead paint remediation, and we had landlords that weren't paying their rent, and that screwed us over. Or sorry, we had tenants that weren't paying their rent. We owned it for a short period of time after moving to California. We originally bought out here when I was 8 years old. We moved to California, and we owned the house for maybe another year or two after we moved to California, and then they sold it because it was more of a headache than it was worth to be a long-distance landlord. It didn't make any sense. And I didn't think they got much money for it. Maybe they got 80 grand for it. I don't know. It might have doubled in value, but with the amount of money they put into it, I don't think they made much profit. I'm sure in the long run it was, I don't know. There was a reason why they sold it. Let's just say that. It wasn't a moneymaker, at least back then. And then we rented for the first 10 years in Southern California. So that was money just pissed away. We didn't own anything for that period. Then we moved up to Northern California. When we moved up to Northern California, my parents had asked me, do you think we should, rent or buy? And I think they were leaning towards wanting to rent. And I knew, I was about 18 at that point, and I knew that, they weren't going to have any kind of a nest egg unless they had, they were just going to keep throwing money away on rent unless we had some kind of investment, unless he was putting his money into something that could last. So I said, I think we should probably buy. We pushed hard for them to buy a house because we knew that, that it's a waste, that we knew it was probably a good investment to buy a house in California at that time, and didn't want the money just to be thrown away on rent. So we talked them into buying, and I'm not going to say exactly how much the house was that they bought. I'll tell you how much it was when they bought it. 280 grand, I think it was, in Northern California. And, they lived there. I lived there off and on because I left for school and was away for 5 years or something like that. Maybe it was, about 5 years. I did live on my own for 5 years. There was a time when I was living alone. And then I moved back and was there for a while. So we were there a total of 21 years, either me or them. Not I wasn't there the whole time, but I was there for 16 years, I guess. And when we sold it, I won't say how much they made, but it was, significantly more. And the money they made with the sale of the house allowed them to buy this house more or less outright, They took a loan, but it was a small loan, not very big. Wouldn't be hard to pay off today. They've been paying it off. It wasn't a large loan. I've been telling them to pay it off because they're just throwing money away on interest on a loan that they don't really need at this point. And my dad's getting to the point where he's being forced to take money out of his retirement accounts because he's reached that age where he has to. They've come to maturity or whatever the hell it is. Um, so he's taking, required disbursements, and they could be putting that towards the mortgage, but they haven't been yet. But all I'm saying is that there's very little outstanding debt on this house. Very little. Less than a car. And it could be paid off if they wanted to in a flash. I keep telling them to do it, and they're not doing it. I don't know why. It's not helping. But all I'm saying is that, all this around me, this all just came from a decision to buy a house in Northern California. And the ability to buy that house in Northern California came from, my dad's hard work. He was a doctor. He became a doctor without a lot of help, without going to a prestigious school. Um, doing it on the cheap in Mexico. Without any inheritance from his parents. My dad's a self-made man. And, so everything that I have is a result of my father's work. Also, my dad got paid pretty well he worked in an HMO in California. And he worked a lot of long hours, and it was, not easy. He was dedicated. He was a great worker, and, always got good reviews, did a great job. And they compensated him fairly well for that, Again, not as much. He didn't get the money that a surgeon would get. He didn't get the money that a specialist would get. He got decent general practitioner money. He didn't get the money that he would get if he'd started his own private practice. But he got paid pretty well. He's a doctor. Doctors get paid pretty well, regardless. Not as well as, we're not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but we have this. It's comfortable. It's nice, But nothing about this, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with the fact that my father is a white man. He earned it for the most part. Maybe he had, is there some amount of white privilege just in terms of everyday how people treat you, getting loans? Yes, he was able to get a loan to buy the house in the first place. I get that. Maybe some black people wouldn't be able to get the loan. I don't know if that's still the case now, if it's still that way, But I think this is part of the thing, So, but meanwhile, like for me, all right, am I going to inherit some of this? Yes. Does any of this have to do with my dad being white? A very, very small percentage of what I'm going to get out of all this has to do with my father being white. It has more to do with the fact that my father was dedicated to becoming a doctor and worked his ass off for many years. That's the privilege I am experiencing privilege, but it's not necessarily white privilege. It's dad worked hard privilege. And my mom worked hard too. She was an OBGYN. She got paid very well. So I totally forgot about that. She didn't put as much money into the house that was bought in Northern California or this house, because, her income was generally her own. I think my dad took on the house expenses more himself. But she made really good money and obviously helped to pay for a lot of the things around the house. She helped to pay the electric bill, and she helped to pay for, whatever repairs were necessary in that house and this house, and she helped to pay for, any kind of things we needed, goods. So, both my parents, and my mom earned decent money too. She earned over 6 figures as a obstetrics nurse. That's how good nursing pays. She eventually became a nurse manager, but she hated that job. My mom's not good with money either. And she stepped down from being a nurse manager because it was a pain in the ass. I know why. Being a mini shift leader, which feels like being a manager some of the time, you don't want to deal with that drama and that BS. But she still got paid, over 6 figures as a nurse. She was having, not initially, but, she started working in Southern California and then worked for quite a while. So all that, I shouldn't have neglected my mother and all that, because she definitely contributed to all this. But my privilege is parental privilege. Very little of it has to do with white privilege. It's if there's a little bit there, sure, I'm willing to acknowledge. Maybe we wouldn't have had, maybe it would have been a lot harder to accumulate all this as a non-white person. But most of this, most of my privilege personally is not white privilege. It's just, you know, my parents worked hard. They worked hard and they made a smart financial decision, buying a house in Northern California instead of renting. And a smart financial decision that was spurred on by myself and my sisters. You know, they probably would have rented if it wasn't for us. We pushed them. I'm not trying to take the credit for their work. They're obviously the ones that paid for it. They're the ones that went to work every day. I had nothing to do with all this, or next to nothing anyway. Other than to say that, to urge them to make the right financial decision, which, like, as I said, they were totally not financially savvy. But, the problem with identity politics is it would tell me that, the largest reason for me being in this house is because I'm a white man and not because of what my parents did, not because of their hard work. And aside from this, around me, I'm not rich myself. I don't have a lot of agency myself. My parents have the money. Eventually, I'll inherit some amount of all this, but it's not going to make me rich. I'm going to be living a very tenuous existence. Unless I rent these rooms out in this house after my parents die, I'm not going to be able to afford to live here. It costs too much money. Even owning the house outright, there's a lot of property taxes. There's a lot of repairs that need to happen. There's a lot of, regular maintenance. It's hard to maintain a house this size. It's not that big. It's, I think, what are we, 3 bedrooms or something like that? Yeah, it's a 3-bedroom house. No, 4, I guess, if you include the bonus room. But the bonus room isn't really a bedroom. But, it's not going to be an easy life for me once they're gone. The only reason why my life is easy now is because of them. It may come to a time where I do have to work 2 jobs in order to pay for all the things, especially since it's getting harder and harder. Now, I'm not a good example, but a lot of the people that you say have white privilege don't have what I have here. They don't have things that their parents, provided for them. Their parents weren't doctors. Their parents were steel workers, or their parents were coal miners, or their parents were, factory workers, or their parents were something less profitable than being a doctor. And when you tell these, and meanwhile, a lot of these industries that their parents worked in collapsed, or a lot of the industries that these people worked in collapsed. And they're white people, and they're struggling, and they're suffering. And when you tell them that they should have everything that they could possibly want because they're white, only because they're white, and men, because they're white men, and they don't have that, and they feel like they're struggling even with that, they're not going to pay any attention to what you're saying, and they're not going to care. They're struggling. If they're struggling, why should they care about your struggle? You want somebody who's struggling to go beyond their own struggle and add additional struggles from other places to their load. That's not going to happen. It's unrealistic. It's silly. And it's elitist because you have enough money that you don't, a lot of these people are white people who have enough money that it's not a problem for them to take on other people's struggle. And whether or not they have that money of their own, efforts, or because they were lucky enough to have inherited it, not everybody has your luck. Not everybody has your lineage. And, you can't expect poor white people to really get behind someone else's cause and someone else's struggles when they have their own struggles of their own. And on top of that, not only do you expect them to get behind those struggles, but you demonize them for not making other people's struggles a priority. And that is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, It's perfectly understandable if you're a black person to, want a better deal for yourself. It's perfectly understandable if you're LGBTQIA plus to want a better deal for yourself. It's perfectly understandable if you're a woman to want a better deal for yourself. And you have to fight for those things. To expect other people to fight your battles for you is, just it comes across as incredibly entitled and incredibly narcissistic. You know, we all have our own struggles. You can't expect other people to take on your struggles. That's the first part of it. Is you discount the people. You know, you act as if because you're a white and cisgender that you shouldn't have any problems. Well, this is, you know, Andy Edwards said it. Everyone's an individual. Everyone's got their own problems to deal with. You know, they may not be your problems, and maybe in some ways you might have it harder than they do. It doesn't mean that they have it easy. You know, and it doesn't mean that they want to hear about your problems. You know, you got enough problems of your own. You don't want to hear about anyone else's problems, and you sure as hell don't want to be demonized for not relating to somebody else's problems. So that's the first thing. Second thing, and this one's a stickier point. You know, so many of these people that live in the world of identity politics are, you know, demonizing people. First of all, demonizing people based on some things that happened in the past. And secondly, are adopting the suffering that never happened to them, to people in their past. You know. We'll start with the first one. You know. Yeah, maybe, you know, like I've said in other videos, I had family that fought for the North in the Civil War. I also had family that, like Franklin Pierce is related to me, who made a worse deal for slaves. You know, I've never seen a dime of money from slave I have no slave. If I have, maybe I have a slave owning ancestor, but I can promise you, none of that money made it through to me. I inherited no great. Like I said, my grandfather left us practically nothing when he died. You know. You cannot blame me for the sins of my ancestors. You know, you cannot blame other white people for the sins of their ancestors. If those white people did inherit some money from, you know, a slave-owning family, and they were a very wealthy family. And again, you know, I've said this in other videos. Most of the slave-owning families were incredibly wealthy, and an incredibly small percentage of white people in general. Only the wealthiest white people owned slaves. Most white people you see have not received a dime of money from slave owners, because it's only the wealthiest families that might have had a shot, you know, to pass that money along down their entire lineage. And it's not even some of those people, you know, even people that descended from wealthy slave owners, a lot of those people aren't seeing a dime either, because the money is used up in a lot of different ways between the time of the slave owner and the time of the child. I don't even blame anybody who had slave owning, you know, grandpa or great grandfathers or whatever, great aunts and uncles. You know, if those people didn't see a dime from the slave owning, then how can you blame the descendants? They have nothing to do with it. They are not living their ancestors' life. You can't blame people, you know, even from father to son. Sometimes, you know, you'll see a dramatic shift in attitude. You'll see people who are rich douchebags who have kids that look at their own parents and say, "How can you behave this way?" You know, and they stand up for justice and they stand up for what's right. You know, they might still have privileges because they're wealthy, but they also look at their parents and know that what their parents represent is bad, and they turn against it. And you can't blame these kids for being born into money. You know, I blame the kids that look at their parents' behavior like Trump and say, "Oh yeah, that's what I want to be, a ruthless businessman who takes from people." You know, Trump is the kind of guy you can blame. And I'm sure there's some slave-owning family out there. I'm sorry, there was somebody with slave-owning ancestors who, you know, their ancestors passed the money down, and their ancestors passed the money down, and they passed the attitudes down of racism and exploitation. And those kids today, you know, inherited money and continue to exploit. You know, and I'm sure they're extremely wealthy people. Maybe you can blame those people. You can blame those people that not only inherited money from the slave owners, but inherited, you know, the general means of exploiting people for their own gain. You know, I don't know how you prove that, but the idea that you can blame descendants of somebody for the sins of their forefathers is wrong. It's wrong. It's, You know, it's unfair. It's it's ridiculous. So that's the first part of it. You know, the second part, you act as if a lot of these people act as if they are living through the pain of their ancestors. So many black people act as if slavery was this you know great injustice done to them personally. But this is many, many, many years in the past. Many, many years in the past. And there are still things, I get it, there's still things that hold you back to some extent, that are a result of the racism that originated in that period. Um, but the relative advantages you have over your ancestors is, you know, humongous, humongous. The level to which racism has eroded since the era of slavery is a huge, huge, huge amount. And I think you have a lot of people, and the same thing with women. Women have more opportunity now than they ever did in history. They have the opportunity to be in the workplace and get an education, and even to rise to positions of power that they would never have been accepted in previously. And a lot of us support that. I support the ability of women to do whatever they want with their lives. But, they look back on how things were in the past, how women previously were, seen as, breeding factories or whatever, just meant to have babies and be homemakers. And they blame modern day men for those injustices. They talk about the patriarchy now. The patriarchy now is not what it once was. When you say smash the patriarchy, what exists now is not the patriarchy like what it was just 40, 50 years ago. Or should I say 50, 60? I don't know. It really started to change around the time of the civil rights movement. But you act as if nothing has changed. This is both sides, and you try to take on the suffering of your ancestors like you're owed something by the people today. But you are not your ancestors, and we are not our ancestors. Just because I'm a cisgender white male, doesn't mean I think like every cisgender white male that came before me, or that I think like my forefathers or their forefathers. And just because you might descend from slaves doesn't mean that you suffered the way they did in any way, shape, or form, or that you even understand a fraction of their suffering. You don't understand a fraction of your ancestors' suffering. You haven't been whipped. You haven't been made into a piece of property. That didn't happen to you. And stop acting like it did. I go on. I watch. Finding Your Roots, and you have all these black people that go on because he likes to feature black people. Since he is black and he's really into the identity politics thing, Louis Gates, and because he was discriminated against, which I can understand being pissed about that. But and you have all these celebrities, these black celebrities that really take it as a personal affront what happened to their ancestors, and just have this sort of they have this sort of this anger, this deep anger for what happened to their ancestors, and act as if it was some kind of personal affront to them. But it's not a personal affront to you. This is what happened. You should be proud of your ancestors for dealing with it. You can be as pissed as you want at the slave owners that whipped your ancestor. I understand that. Be pissed. But don't take it out on us. Don't take it out on people today. We didn't whip your ancestors. It's like there's this sort of transference that happens where they look at what happened by the smallest percentage of extremely wealthy white people, 100 years ago. Is it 100? Maybe more than 100 now. And they extrapolate it to the modern day and hold this resentment and this hostility. and it exists today. There's this sort of there's this sort of lack of a willingness to to trust the modern day white man because they see it. Oh, well, back in the days, I was watching this program on TV, and like in the old days, I guess during the slave rebellions, there were some poor white people, indentured servants, would join up with the slave rebellions. Then at some point they realized that they could divide and conquer, so they gave some of the indentured servants, they freed them or gave them more rights, and suddenly they turned against their black compatriots and would snitch on them if they tried to get away or something like that. I forget what the issue was, but um, you know, just because they couldn't trust those people back then doesn't mean you can't trust us. We're not the same. We're not going to turn our backs on you the way the indentured servants did back then. But there's this idea. I watched this documentary, and there's there's this hate. I watched especially Tanahashi Coates. He takes it personally. He acts like the white people today are the same as the white people then. Nothing has changed since then. That we're just as culpable for the blame for that type of attitude as those people were. And it's not fair. It's not fair to people like us, It's not fair for you to demonize a person. It is. It is. I know people say this all the time. White guys say this, but it's reverse racism. You're no better than, you're definitely better than the slave owners back then. But the general principle of judging somebody for the color of their skin. They've even demonized the idea of saying we should be colorblind. That should be the goal. That's what Martin Luther King was calling for. Would someone not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character? But you're not even listening to, the greatest single, agent for change in your history. Martin Luther King was a great man. He understood that it was about equality. But now you're not interested in equality. You're interested in putting yourself up on a pedestal because your ancestors suffered. But you didn't suffer the way your ancestors suffered. Do you suffer a little bit? Yes. You suffer a little bit. There's still inequality. There are some things that you have to deal with that make your life harder than a white man's life. I'm willing to acknowledge that. But the level to which you are making it out that you're suffering worse than we are is beyond ridiculous. I'm sorry. For the most part, these days, while you do have to deal with a little more adversity than we do, we face a lot of the same struggles. And some of us overcome those struggles, and some of us don't. And for you to prejudge us, for you to assume that we're all the same, we all have the same privilege, that our journey wasn't marred by other things that have nothing to do with, sexual or racial identity. For you to assume that is racist or sexist or, it's ignorant and it's narcissistic, and it's why people voted for Trump. That backlash happened because we're tired of, I'm going to say we, it's not even me because I voted for Kamala, but the people that voted for Trump are tired of, not having a voice. That's what how Andy Edwards put it. You want to marginalize, you want to act as if poor white people don't matter anymore. And the more you try to tell poor white people that their problems don't matter, and that only your problems are the only ones worth thinking about and worth focusing on in the modern day, the more they're going to push back against you, because that's a ridiculous attitude. It's elitist and narcissistic, and nobody is going to listen to you, and no one's going to care what you think. I'm personally as more of a liberal than than a lot of white men. I'm willing to acknowledge that you don't. I'm willing to acknowledge that yes, you do face additional challenges for being black. You do face additional challenges for not being accepted as a trans person, or not being accepted as gay, or for bigotry and for chauvinism against women, or for closed-mindedness, or but So it's not. I'm not trying to say that. Yeah, we're it's not 100% equal. There's no question about it. There are some things you have to deal with, but the level to which you are blowing them up to be something that they really aren't anymore, and the level to which you want to put yourself up on a pedestal because of the suffering of people that came before you, is off-putting, and it's more importantly, it's not serving your purposes. You know, people are pushing back with Trump because of that attitude. And a lot of people are just going to see a white man talking here and say, oh, well, this is a white man. He doesn't understand the problem, so F him. We're going to keep on pushing along. Well, you keep pushing along, you'll see where it gets you. You're going to get more Trumps. You get somebody who's worse than Trump. You know, you got to realize that the struggle is not about white versus black. It's not about gay versus straight or trans versus not trans or woman versus man. The struggle is about the wealthy versus the poor. That is the struggle. You know, all these other issues are distraction. You know, in no way do you suffer more adversity as a person of color or as a woman or as somebody in the LGBTQIA plus community. No way do you suffer more adversity than poor people suffer adversity at the hands of rich people. That is the real. That is the real. That's the real adversity. The adversity of the poor vastly outweighs any disadvantages you have because of your skin color or your gender or your sexual preference. And until you people realize that, we're going to stay divided because you're going to stay on your hill, and white people are going to push, poor white people are going to push back on you, and there will never be any unity. There'll just be constant division, constant expectation that other people care about your problems as much as you care about your problems. There are some problems that we share. Those are the things that should be focused on. The things that are your problem. I encourage you to keep fighting for yourself. Fighting for the problems that you have. I'm not trying to say I don't support you. I want to see. I have no problem seeing black people in positions of power, women in positions of power, LGBTQIA people in positions of power. None of that bothers me. I have no problem with people, making their representative group proud and overcoming the adversity that you face in your own sphere. I get it, but you got to earn that on your own. You can't pass that along to everyone else. And meanwhile, we all have problems that we can work on together if you care enough to, figure out what those are, and if you care enough to get together with people who aren't like you, and realize that that we're all being exploited, and that the big exploitation is not white versus black or woman versus man or gay versus straight. The big exploitation is the wealthy exploiting the poor. And there's more of us than there are of them. And we can do something about it if you guys ever get off your effing high horse and we can all get together and actually talk about what can be done about it.